here is exactly how you can use Jira for task management. So the first step is to create our brand new space or project. And this might still say project for you because Jira kind of does a gradual rollout, but eventually these will all be called spaces. And you'll be able to create your new space by clicking the plus icon right next to that sidebar element. When you click that, you get brought to this screen. And probably the most critical part of this process is actually creating the right project or the right space. And this is where a lot of end users get tripped up when it comes to task or project management. Because there's so many different templates and ways and products and things that you can create here, if you create the wrong one, you might be overcomplicating what you need. So there's 3 different products, and I actually like to just click on these down here rather than going through the templates because I like to start from a blank anyway. And I will click on the product that I need and find the template that's associated with it. So in this case, for all task tracking, we're going to be looking at a Jira business project. And this gets a little bit more confusing because when you click on Jira, this has 2 types of projects. You have the business and then you have the software. And some of these will say different things like development tasks and bugs. You have your blank business, you have your space management for like other things that are business related, team or personal space type projects. And a lot of these are a little bit confusing. So the one that I like to go to by default is going to be the blank space, which says business in it. So start fresh with a blank business space template. That's going to be your Jira business project. You're going to be starting from a blank slate, and I'll show you exactly how to populate the right workflows, fields, etc. in a little bit. So I'll create this and name this project task tracking. We're going to keep things very simple. And one other thing to note here is to not use team managed projects. Team managed projects are a little bit easier to use and manage. That being said, they are a lot more limited. And in terms of scalability, larger teams, and actually collaborating with your team on these projects, you're going to run into a lot of problems down the road. And frankly, a lot of times when I come in to start to consult on a Jira environment, the first preliminary step is to take all the team managed projects and migrate them to company managed. So if you can, there are sometimes reasons you cannot create company managed projects when you're not like a Jira admin, for example. But if you can, I highly recommend just going straight with company managed. So that's pretty much all we need here. We click on next. It's going to bring up another screen, but we can skip this step or invite other users once that pops up here in just a moment. Usually it doesn't take this long. There we go. So I'll skip this page for now. And now we go to our brand new project that just got created. And before I jump into actually configuring this, let me show you the difference between something like this, which is a business project, and something like this, which is a software project. So the first thing that you'll notice is that the sidebar actually has multiple boards. And business projects kind of have the same thing in terms of the views, but they're not organized in quite the same way, and they're a lot simpler to manage. So all the development features live in here. You got your development, your coding, security, releases, deployments. When you actually click on a work item, you have your fields associated to development tools, your sprints, your story points. None of that is really relevant for task and project management. So that's why we're not using a project like this. And on top of that, we also have more configuration settings when it comes to boards. So I could go in here and actually go to a layout and have different column layouts with different statuses, different swim lanes, card options, quick filters, stuff that, again, is usually really not needed on a general business project when you're task tracking and project tracking. So let's head back to our original board that we just created. And we're going to need to do the first thing, which is going to be to configure the workflow, because we're starting with something very basic, which is just to do, in progress, and done. And a lot of times this is actually a great place to start. So if this is enough for you to get started and just track some basic tasks, fantastic. You could leave these out of box and kind of go from there and create your first work item. So I could name this task 1. There we go. My first work item is created. But usually teams will need a little bit more to actually track the work that's happening on their project. So to do this, we go to the 3 dots at the top right or the 3 dots next to our project or space, and then we go to our space settings. In here, we have a tab for work items, or workflows actually in this case. Depending on the project you're looking at, sometimes workflows are nested under work items. So workflows is what we're going to click on. And then in order to add new things, change things, remove things, all we need to do is click the edit workflow icon. And now that brings us to the workflow editor. And there's a lot that we can do here. I'll cover a couple of very basic elements. But really at its core, this is all of our statuses that we can use, that we can add, that we can remove, and then the transitions that we can modify, add restrictions to, add automations to. And this isn't my preferred method to add automations, but you can run some basic automations here as well. So for example, let's say I have to do, in progress, and done. I maybe want to add a pending status. So I'll add a status in, I'll call it pending. I might already have one available. If I don't, I would go to the create a new status tab. But since we already have it, I'll just select it and add it. And there we go. We now have a pending status, and I like to organize these based on the status types or status categories. Everything that's gray is sort of like a to-do item or needs to be done. Everything blue is something that is in progress, and everything green is something that has been officially completed. And you could have multiple in these types of categories. So for example, we have to do, but we could also add like a backlog status. Backlog might symbolize something a little bit different, where it's something that you're not actively needing to do, but it is something you will do in the future. So in this example, we have a very simple flow of to do, and we might have a backlog where something doesn't need to currently be done, but something will eventually need to be done. Then in progress, something's in motion. Pending, which is something is blocked or waiting on a particular approval or something else. And then we have done, and that just means a work item or a task is completed. Now that we have our changes made, all we need to do is hit the update workflow. And before I go back to my project and show you what it looks like, a couple more things that you could do here that are really, really cool. First one being adding restrictions. So for example, if I want to go to the backlog, I could go to rules and click the little plus icon. And in here, we could add restrictions, validate rules, or perform actions. And restrictions essentially allow you to block because of certain actions. So a really good example is blocking until approval, or you can add restrictions for specific or all users. You could add restrictions to not allow something to go to blocked until it's gone through, let's say, in progress. I don't know why you'd want that, but that is an option here as an example. But you could use validators, restrictions, or anything else. And probably the most common thing you'll ever use here is to validate a field. So I'll do a really classic example of this to say that when something goes into the backlog from any status, we want to make sure that the assignee is not empty. And I'll say isn't empty. I'll find the assignee, check that box, and enter an error message. Please enter value for assignee. And the reason we enter the error message is because the user won't know why it's not working or why it's not transitioning unless we do this. So I'll click on add, and I added now my validator or my restriction to this particular status transition. And we don't do this on the status level, so you click on the status, you don't get this option. But if you click on the little transition or the little arrow next to it, that allows you to actually add your rules by clicking the plus icon. So keep that in mind. And one other thing that I highly suggest here is to not overdo it with restrictions. This oftentimes becomes a point of people and teams and companies hating Jira and the way that it works. They just overload all the restrictions, require a bunch of information, require data without thinking about if they even need it. And then when you're starting to work through a particular project and creating new tasks and going in progress, and there's tons of things to fill out, tons of requirements, it just becomes a pain to use. And not only does your team avoid it, but then they start hating it, and then the work isn't tracked. So only require things that are absolutely, absolutely necessary that you would need, for example, for reporting reasons like an assignee field. And even in those scenarios, you could run an automation to auto-assign tasks to whoever made a transition or added a comment to avoid adding these kinds of restrictions. So just a quick side note there, but I'll update this workflow. Now let's head back to the project and take a look at what we have. So inside of my board, you'll see that we now have a couple of new statuses. And we have our backlog, our pending, and our in progress and done stayed the same. Let's test out that really quick validator that we added, or the condition that we added. And then I'll throw this task into backlog without having the assignee added to it. And you'll see that it gets thrown right back to where it was. And it says, please enter value for assignee. So I'll have to go in here, assign this ticket, and then throw it into backlog. And this time it should actually stick. So just a really quick example, because I know a lot of times companies struggle with collecting the right information. So that's one way that you can easily collect that information for specific field values. That way you can actually have accurate reporting. But again, tread very lightly and don't overdo this piece. So that's our workflow setup. Now that we have everything good to go and our work can travel from to do all the way through done, and our workflow process is completed, we might need some extra information included within these work items. And that comes in the form of fields. There's a lot of really good out-of-box ones that are available. You have your summary at the very top. You have your description, which is a rich text, which is phenomenal for formatting, and anything that you would normally do like in Confluence can easily be done here as well. So I could add things like a divider. I could add headers and bolds and underlines and anything else that I'd like. So a lot of options here. You could get very creative, and I often use these pretty much on every work item, I would say, because they're so nice to format with. So definitely use that field to your advantage. You have subtasks and linked worked items, and then you have a comment section. This is great to collaborate, communicate with your team on. You could at people and tag people here to check in on progress, see what's going on, to have everything sort of in one place when you're working on something in particular, because oftentimes these things can get lost inside of your Slack threads and Teams threads. So it's better to keep everything in one task that's actually being associated with this specific deliverable. And then on the top right, we once again have status. We saw this on the board view, but we also have the ability to change it here. And then on the right side, we have what are called our context fields. And this is just more information that's associated with this work item. And out of box, we have your basic things like assignee and reporter. Reporter is just whoever created the request. You got your priority fields, your category fields, a little more field section with time tracking options. But sometimes you need more information and more data that needs to be collected in a very specific way, in a specific format. To do this, we add fields. And we add fields by clicking this configure button on the bottom right. And then in here, we could pull in fields in our system. And if it doesn't exist, if the field that we need doesn't yet exist in Jira, what we do is we go to the custom fields section. And this brings us to our fields, system fields within Jira. And these fields are site-wide. So any project can use and reuse and associate information with these fields. And you do have to have a certain level of permissions to access this because it can break a lot of things. So make sure you're not deleting things or removing things or changing things that might be in use. But to create a new field, all you need to do is click the Create New Field button on the top right. We're going to select, let's say, a number field. And we'll give this field a name, and we'll call this, let's just call this ID field, something very random. Sometimes teams use something like an ID field, and we'll just leave this as number instead of percentage or currency. We'll hit create, and our new field is now in our Jira site. Now, if we head back to our project, so I'll go back to the screen I was looking at earlier, and if I search for that ID field, I should see it popping up right here on the right side. I could pull that in and just drag it exactly where I want to see it. So I'll pull that in right under, I'll put it at the bottom of my context fields, and I will save my changes. Now I could head back and refresh this page, and I should see my ID field popping up right where I placed it right here. So if you ever need any new field options or specific information that you want to collect, you could easily do that by going to your field settings and then associating them with your tasks. I definitely would also be wary of like overloading and over requiring information on these types of tasks. You don't want to have like 50 fields here that are shown, because then a lot of the information is lost that might actually be critical. So now we've set up our workflows to have our work be moving from in progress or from to do to all the way to done. And we've set up all of our context and information with these work items. The next step is to go over and clean up a couple of our navigation items. And while I do that, I'll go over the couple of options that I like to use most of the time. So there's a summary tab here. I personally don't find this too useful because I prefer using dashboards within Jira to do very specific reporting on very specific things. This is a pre-built dashboard that gives you some out-of-box things that you might find relevant. Otherwise, I just like to remove this and not have it, show up on my top navigation bar and keep things very, very clean. So I'll remove that. The board view is the one that I use the most in Jira. I love having a visualization of seeing tasks move from left to right. I see exactly where work is and like what the progress is of it, of each task. And I could see, for example, things that are in pending. Maybe I could clear up a blocker there, things that are in progress that I know need action on. It's probably the most easy and visualized way to actually see tasks moving through your workflow. So that's why I like it so much. There's also list view. I find this one very handy, especially when you use any kind of hierarchies, because they do have little carrots that drop down. Let me see if I could find a quick example of that, maybe in the marketing team. So if you do have, I do not have any in there. I should have one that has some content in it. Let's see, there we go. So we have things like this where you could literally click little drop downs, see hierarchies, see how things roll up into one another, see parent and child relationships. Makes it really easy with like subtasks and parent tasks. So I love to use this view for any kind of visualization. Same thing with the timeline view. Timeline is great to, let me head back to my task tracking project. Timeline is great to see not only list view, but sort of a start and end time. And you could easily visualize that kind of a time frame on this view as well. So you could have your tasks laid out, when they start, when they end, what's happening, especially for larger projects. When you have that hierarchy in here, it's a phenomenal view to use. Calendar, I tend not to use as much because I use the timeline view. So that's one I would also remove. And the reason I suggest removing the navigation bar items are, if you don't use them, they're just gone. It's easier to have a very clean view that you know you're going to use on a daily basis. So I usually clean them up if I don't need them. And a lot of apps show up here, so I'll remove those, including shortcuts and archived work items, components if I don't use those, reports, I typically don't use those, all work items, which are essentially another view of the list view. I like to remove this one as well. Attachments show all of your attachments in one place. I don't find it relevant, so I remove that. So these are the typical items that I would leave. Forms is sometimes fantastic for end users or like people in your team to just fill out a couple of quick fields and essentially create a work item on your board or a task on your board for you. So that's a great way and great use case of doing that. So you could leave those if you're using them. If you're not using them, you can remove them. And then pages are also really great to link things directly to Confluence. And Confluence is another Atlassian product if you don't know what it is. And it's sort of a documentation tool. It's a replacement for Word or Notion or similar Google Doc type environments. And it works really well with Jira because we can connect a space to it and see pages right in here natively without ever leaving Jira at all. So it feels like a very native and intuitive experience that you then can integrate directly into Jira. So that's one I pretty much always leave because I use Confluence a ton and I link it a lot to my Jira work items. So that is our task tracking within Jira. If hopefully that makes sense in terms of how I like to set this up. There are a couple of things that you really do need to know when actually running these types of tasks within Jira. Primarily creating the right project first is really going to set you up for success, and then setting up your workflows, not overcomplicating them. Same thing with your fields, not over requiring them and not adding too many of them. Keeping things simple, including the navigation, to actually make this like a fun and usable experience for your team. The moment you start to overload things and over require things, that's when this really starts to break down and teams really start to hate using Jira. And now that we have your task tracking set up in Jira, the next step is to create more advanced workflows. We covered the basics here and set up something that'll work and get you up and running. But if you want to learn more about how to actually set up approvals, restrictions, requirements, more complex things within your workflows that you'll need on a day-to-day basis, check out this video here.